That may be the greatest catch I've ever seen in my life.
Okay, so I know most people would rather us go through and talk Cooper Kupp. I mean, talk about some players that are at the very beginning of startup drafts. But honestly, maybe more importantly, I think that we should be focusing in on players that are completely free right now, because I see in every single Patreon Flock Dynasty League, people are going through and cutting, 10 players off their roster. And for my opinion, seemingly no reason at this point. And you are just beginning to be able to go through and pick up guys off the waiver wire in a lot of different formats. And you also, of course, are making just trades consistently where you can look for some throw-in players. Say your buddy John decides to say, hey man, I'll trade you Jalen Waddle for T. Higgins. And instead of just accepting it right away, might as well say, okay, you got KJ Hamler? Can you just throw in KJ Hamler on this deal? And of course, they're going to agree to that every single time. So identifying those players at the very end of rosters that you want as throw-ins in trades, or potentially you can even get off the waiver wire, is going to be very important. But please, 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 if you have not done so already, and everybody here should have done this by now, but go down there, drop a like on this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. If I say anything stupid, just go down there, correct me. If you don't agree with me, let me know why you don't agree so I can hopefully get my process better for the next video and the next video and the next video. But that should be it. Let's go through. Let's dive into these options. And the first player I'm going to talk about is way more expensive than any of these other guys. So you're going to begin to see exactly how cheap these options are. Joshua Palmer. Now, I am not coming out here and discovering electricity or anything. Obviously, this is not a secret that Joshua Palmer is a player that, is, I want to say, moving up dynasty rankings almost across the board at this point. Not only is he moving up dynasty rankings, what's very interesting is if you actually go and look at best ball drafts at the moment, Joshua Palmer is going pretty damn high. Compared to the other guys in this list, Joshua Palmer, you're having to pay a premium. I would even say, going back to that deal where maybe your buddy decides to offer you Jalen Waddle for T. Higgins. If you go back on that one, say, hey, throw in Joshua Palmer. At this point, Palmer may not even be just a throw-in for a lot of people. And the reasons are clear. You have Mike Williams with an expiring contract, as well as Jalen Guyton. And I really want to focus in on Jalen Guyton right now, because I would be surprised if this team decides to bring Jalen Guyton back, and that's going to be very important. While Jalen Guyton really has not been productive by any means of the imagination for a very long time, if you look at the snap rates from Jalen Guyton over the past 2 seasons, he's playing a significant amount of downs for this Los Angeles Chargers offense, and he's essentially operating as just the field stretching wide receiver. Especially, remember at the beginning part of this season, you actually had Mike Williams instead of with the average depth of target of 20 yards down the field. He was operating as the alpha X wide receiver, and you had Jalen Guyton sliding over to presumably that pure field stretching threat, that guy that maybe is not going to provide a lot of fantasy value, but he's going to be soaking up a ton of snaps in that offense with Justin Herbert. And that made it difficult for Jalen Guyton to get on the field, where I think at this point, most likely you are going to be getting Mike Williams back to Los Angeles. But if Jalen Guyton is to leave, I think what we are going to see with the deployment of these wide receivers, clearly you're still going to have Keenan Allen as the flanker, soaking up, the majority of the volume underneath, closer to the line of scrimmage. But instead of seeing Mike Williams as that prototypical alpha X wide receiver, I think that he will probably slide over to be a little bit more of that Jalen Guyton field stretcher, because we've seen Mike Williams operate in that role a ton throughout his NFL career. Especially at the end of this past season, we remember the sharp drop off that you had from Mike Williams on a points per game basis. Really, if you're looking at any metric, go look at his targets per game through the first month, 5-6 weeks. I don't know exactly how long that time period was to the rest of the season. And it was 100% because the change in roles. So the departure of Jalen Guyton, sliding Mike Williams over to be the field stretching wide receiver, may actually open up, I don't want to say an every down role for Joshua Palmer, but something close to it where he is actually at least possibly going to get 7 targets a game, 6 targets a game. And while that's not everything in, the Chicago Bears offense, you get 6 targets a game in Chicago, who the hell cares? Darnell Mooney's getting 8 targets a game and he's a wide receiver 3 in fantasy. But if you're getting 6 targets a game and you're doing so with Justin Herbert, you're doing so with one of the premier quarterbacks in the NFL for probably the next 5 seasons, I think that we can be very excited. Now, with Josh Palmer, I will admit, I did not like him as a prospect. And I actually talked about this a little bit earlier with a previous mock draft that we did. And we had a lot of people down there in the comment section. I don't know if a lot of people, I know we had one person saying, Mason, stop talking about what these guys were coming out of college. Why does it matter what you thought of Joshua Palmer, the prospect coming out of Tennessee? If he's going into his 2nd season in the NFL. Well, why it does matter, to be completely honest, is because with these players not getting an opportunity in year 1, we really don't have any other information to draw upon. Now, Joshua Palmer was able to get on the field. He played 17 games, drew almost 50 targets. But keep in mind, if you look at that as a per game basis, Joshua Palmer essentially averaged 3 targets a game. And I don't necessarily think we can blame him. I didn't like Joshua Palmer coming out of Tennessee. I had no idea that he was going to be drafted anywhere close to where he was. He was almost a top 100 pick in the NFL draft. He went with the 13th pick in the 3rd round. He wasn't particularly dominant at Tennessee. He didn't really break out at an early age. His metric profile from a prospect standpoint, very bad. But what he can fall back on is the fact that he gets the 3rd round draft capital. And to go along with this, he could potentially be playing an every down role with one of the best quarterbacks in football. And that's with the assumption Mike Williams stays in Los Angeles and just the departure of Jalen Guyton, who was playing a significant amount of snaps. But let's go to our next wide receiver. Going to be much cheaper. I think you can get him almost everywhere on waiver wires. It's going to be Anthony Schwartz, another player going into year 2 and an option that I don't think I told a single person to draft this past season. I don't even know if we had him ranked in our top 48 rookies because he looked like, just a prototypical field stretching, roster clogging wide receiver. Drafted in the 3rd round to the Cleveland Browns. He wasn't that productive at Auburn. Now, I don't want to make it seem like he wasn't playing at all. No, he was able to draw targets at Auburn. He was definitely an every down player, yada, yada, yada. But that's not what got him drafted in the 3rd round. What got him drafted in the 3rd round is speed. Now, it's reported, keep in mind, these pro day times, they're laughable. If this was at the NFL Combine, of course, it would be a completely different story. But it was reported that this guy has Henry Ruggs speed at the Auburn Combine. And that's what got him drafted in the 3rd round by the Cleveland Browns. And I want to reiterate, draft capital at the receiver position does not matter nearly as much as it does at quarterback and as it does at running back, because we can see draft capital for different wide receivers mean different things. Going back to what we were talking about this past season, Tutu Atwell, someone we're going to be talking about later on in this video, gets drafted in the 2nd round because he does have that elite speed. And with that elite speed, you can stretch the field, and without really even drawing any targets and having any fantasy production, you can still have real life NFL value by opening up space underneath for the other wide receivers to operate in your offense. Whereas someone like Amari St. Brown is the exact opposite of that. With Amari St. Brown, he is not going to be able to provide more real life NFL value than he will as a fantasy football wide receiver, primarily operating closer to the line of scrimmage, being a slot guy that's, yes, able to get open, but not much more than that. Very similar to a Jarvis Landry. The perfect example is going back, and looking what the Miami Dolphins decided to do when they had the combination of Kenny Stills and Jarvis Landry going over 100 receptions. And then they decided, you know what? Probably more important to keep Kenny Stills on this roster and let Jarvis Landry go to Cleveland. But of course, that's just one of many examples that we can look at. So with this 3rd round draft capital from Anthony Schwartz, I don't want to act like it is, everything we should be basing our decisions off of, but I'm operating under the assumption that Anthony Schwartz also has it in his range of outcomes to become an every down player for Cleveland this upcoming season. Because if you look at the Cleveland Browns depth chart right now, I mean, of course, Donovan Peoples-Jones is going to be more expensive. I wanted to include Donovan Peoples-Jones on this list, and at the very beginning of the offseason, we said, I mean, hell, Jarvis Landry, Rashad Higgins, they're probably out of Cleveland this offseason. Go get Donovan Peoples-Jones. And I've actually seen Donovan Peoples-Jones and his best ball draft price, as well as his dynasty price, increase over the past month or so. Of course, not because we said it on this channel. I mean, our channel's not nearly big enough to do that, but just because the overall community is kind of waking up to what we're getting in Cleveland. Because right now, the Cleveland Browns have the potential to move on from Jarvis Landry and save $15 million. Now, I'm no mathematician. Of course, I am just an idiot with a microphone, but I'd imagine that they would probably prefer to have the $15 million and try to go sign a different wide receiver other than keep Jarvis Landry at this point. And then also, I mean, Rashad Higgins, someone else who has played a decent amount of time for this offense over the past 2 seasons, I mean, he's looking like he is probably out of Cleveland. I mean, at least his contract's expired. Of course, they could always choose to bring him back. But as it stands currently, really, the only 2 wide receivers left over in this wide receiver room after Odell departed halfway through the year could be Donovan Peoples-Jones and Anthony Schwartz. And with Schwartz, I think that he could get on the field if this team needs that field stretching element. I know Donovan Peoples-Jones does provide that somewhat, as he is that big-bodied athletic wide receiver, but still, Schwartz is someone that I don't think should be on your waiver wire because it's definitely in the range of outcomes for him as a 21-year-old wide receiver this upcoming season to go get on the field, play almost every single snap. And then if he has 2 blow-up games in a row where maybe he just has that typical field-stretching wide receiver game where he goes for 4 receptions and he hauls in 2 touchdowns that go for 50-plus yards, then all of a sudden you can just flip him for a future second-round pick. Now, let's go over to another player that was drafted in this past year's NFL draft. And this is honestly probably my favorite guy on this list. It's going to be Amari Rodgers. Now, with Amari Rodgers, another example of someone that I didn't really like coming out of school as a prospect this past year. And I do have to bring up their prospect profile because, as I said previously, when you're looking at someone like Joshua Palmer, when you're looking at someone like Amari Rodgers, and we don't have enough data points where we can accurately evaluate these players based on their rookie seasons, what else do you want me to look at? Do you want me to try to call up the Green Bay? Do I need to call up Matt LaFleur and go, hey, man, how did Amari Rodgers look in practice this past? Of course, we can't do that. I mean, he only drew 8 targets his rookie year. Very bad. Very bad. And coming out of Clemson, he wasn't a great prospect either. Now, keep in mind, he was at Clemson. He played alongside T. Higgins. I mean, he played alongside Justin Ross earlier in his career as well. So you shouldn't necessarily expect that Amari Rodgers was going to be able to dominate, but he was an every down player, and that Trevor Lawrence offense didn't break out at an early age, wasn't dominant in school, yada, yada, yada. Wasn't a great prospect. But I got news for y'all. The guys we're getting off the waiver wire, how many great prospects are we going to be getting off the waiver wire? How many guys are we going to be getting that average 45% of their collegiate production at Clemson? That's just not happening. Of course, those players are going way higher and are way more valuable. So we have to be just trying to identify younger players that we could see an uptick in value. I mean, if you pick someone up off the waiver wire and 6 months from now can trade them for a second round pick, you make 3 or 4 those moves a year. All of a sudden, I mean, just with compounding interest essentially on those second round future picks, and if you can flip those into future, you are creating a juggernaut dynasty team from nothing. And here with Amari Rodgers, let's go through this Green Bay situation. Now, of course, there's the chance Aaron Rodgers is not the quarterback of the Green Bay Packers. And if that happens, and if it's Jordan Love, I think we can be very pessimistic about this situation overall. But to look at this team, right now, Randall Cobb, yes, is under contract. But let me pull up exactly how old Randall Cobb is, because I already wrote this down. They can save $7 million by moving on from Randall Cobb. He'll be 32 this upcoming season. Now, I don't know if that's going to be something that they look to do, but it's definitely in the range of outcomes. Marquez Valdes-Scantling is a free agent. Alan Lazard is a free agent. Equanimeous St. Brown is a free agent. Davante Adams. Now, of course, I'm saying Davante Adams last year, even though he's the most important, but that's because they'll franchise tag him. So Davante Adams, technically a free agent. I would be very surprised if Davante Adams works his way out of Green Bay. I mean, really, the only way I could see that happening is if Aaron Rodgers is gone from Green Bay. And if that happens, who the hell knows what Green Bay is going to do. But nonetheless, probably bring Davante Adams back. But as it stands, I mean, say you had Amari Rodgers as the wide receiver 5 on this team, behind Marquez Valdes-Scantling, behind Randall Cobb, behind Allen Lazard, behind Equanimeous St. Brown. I mean, sorry, maybe he was the wide receiver 6 this past season. There is a path. And of course, they can always decide to go out there and sign an injured Odell Beckham Jr., sign an injured Chris Godwin, sign an injured Michael Gallup in free agency. But if you haven't noticed, this free agent class, I mean, look very appealing at the beginning of the season. But since then, Allen Robinson completely busted. The injuries to Odell, Chris Godwin, Gallup have made it a lot less appealing. So who knows? Maybe, just maybe, Amari Rodgers is the wide receiver 2 or maybe the wide receiver 3 for the Green Bay Packers this upcoming season. Still only 22 years old, was drafted last year. And if you're going to be able to get an every down player for essentially free in an Aaron Rodgers offense, or someone that at least has the shot worth picking up from the waiver wire. Now, our next wide receiver, we previously mentioned him, is going to be Tutu Atwell. Now, with Atwell, I will be the first one to admit, I thought that Robert Woods was not guaranteed to be back in Los Angeles this next season. But, I mean, looking at it, they're most likely bringing Robert Woods back. I think they can save like $6 million or so. And with Robert Woods, I mean, it seems like he tore his ACL late in the year. But, I mean, it was November 13th. So I think if you're looking at that timeline, Robert Woods should be good to go by close to the beginning of this next season. Odell Beckham Jr. is a different story. Odell tearing his ACL February 13th. That's brutal. I mean, if we just go through and assume a 9-month timetable for Odell Beckham Jr., which we could potentially expect that to be a little bit longer, given the fact that this isn't his first torn ACL, and to go along with this, he's significantly older than what he once was. So let's just assume best case scenario takes Odell 9 months to get back from this. Then you're getting him in November. You're getting him in week 8, week 9, week 10, best case scenario. Now, with Tutu Atwell, very, very similar to what we had with Anthony Schwartz. I actually think that Tutu Atwell was a significantly better prospect. Now, I know, and of course everybody else does as well, that the issue with Tutu Atwell is the size. I mean, I can't lie to y'all. He weighs 155 pounds. I weigh like 5 pounds more than that. Like I weigh more than Tutu Atwell. That is hilarious to me. And the reason he ends up going in the second round to the Los Angeles Rams is purely based on that speed. But we kind of saw the story play out this past year where Van Jefferson was a wide receiver that everybody, including myself, I was laughing at people taking Van Jefferson, as Van Jefferson, I mean, was a 24-year-old rookie that failed that the Los Angeles Rams took in the second round purely based off speed. I was laughing at people for taking him this past season, and he eventually worked his way up to being an every down player for the Los Angeles Rams. I believe that Tutu Atwell actually has that in his range of outcomes for his second season. If we go back to his production at, I believe he went to Louisville. I mean, he was fantastic. He broke out his freshman season. He was dominant as well on a percentage basis of that Louisville offense. He was a hyper-productive collegiate wide receiver. He did get the NFL draft capital. He's playing in one of the best offenses in the NFL, and he is completely free. I mean, after being drafted in the second round of the NFL draft this past year. So I'm going to be willing to pick up Tutu Atwell, but of course, not running to do so. Now, our next wide receiver is someone that y'all know I have to bring up, and I'm not going to lie. I was very sad halfway through the year because the Denver Broncos decided to extend Tim Patrick, decided to extend Courtland Sutton, and I was sitting here going, oh my God, is KJ Hamler ever going to get a shot? I mean, with KJ Hamler, very similar to a couple of these other guys. I mean, he was a pretty good prospect coming out of Penn State, but the reason he goes in the second round is because of his 40-yard dash time. It is because his speed ends up running like a 4.27 at the Penn State Pro Day, and of course, it's a Pro Day number. You can't trust it. But nonetheless, rumored to have that Henry Ruggs speed. Now, that's something that's going to be more valuable for your NFL team than it's going to be for fantasy, as we previously discussed. But with KJ Hamler, he was hyper productive at Penn State. Not only was he productive at Penn State, but this was an offense that had other talented wide receiver options, guys like, Jahan Dotson, someone like Mike Gesicki as well. And with KJ Hamler, still incredibly young. He's going to be 22 years old at the start of this upcoming season. He will turn 23 this year. Now, I was worried because they extended Tim Patrick, they extended Courtland Sutton, but diving into those contracts, they're fake extensions. Especially that Courtland Sutton deal, I would be shocked, and I repeat, shocked if that past this next year. So if the Denver Broncos decide to move on from Tim Patrick after this upcoming season, they will save $9 million. If the Denver Broncos decide to move on from Courtland Sutton this upcoming season, they will save $12 million. And I know Courtland Sutton has name value, but if you're looking at the actual value that he brings, and whether that's to fantasy football players, to an NFL team, I don't necessarily think that they're going to be willing to pay Sutton that $12 million contract this upcoming season if they like what they see out of the combination of Jerry Jeudy and KJ Hamler, when you're going to be able to use that money elsewhere, especially if they prioritize bringing in one of those veteran premium quarterbacks. So I'm not saying it's a guarantee. I would say it's probably more than likely that they reevaluate this wide receiver room going into this next season and choose one receiver between Tim Patrick and Courtland Sutton to keep based on the performance of each player. But it's a possibility that KJ Hamler, I don't want to say this year, but he's only 22 years old. And I know he's a roster clogger wide receiver. Of course, if you're playing in a 10-team league where you only have 8 bench spots, don't pick up any of these guys. But this is for those 12-team leagues where you're rostering 25 players. He's a roster clogger wide receiver, but you can have the space, and not this season, but the following year, he could potentially be an every down wide receiver in an offense that hopefully gets a quarterback upgrade, and who knows? Maybe I'm honestly underselling him a little bit. I love me some KJ Hamler. Possibly he can try to leapfrog one of these guys in the depth chart this year. But of course, thank you so much for being a part of the flock and supporting the channel. I really hope you enjoyed this podcast. I really hope you got something from it. And yeah, I hope that you have a great day as well.